Well, I interaction, so it makes a huge difference. All right, we're going to get started in about 5 minutes, a little less, 2, 3 minutes. So just wanted to give you an update because I know some people are still drifting in, and then we'll kind of walk through how to get everyone involved and look forward to the discussion. let me send a few down here. You can pass those down. There you go. Anyone else looking for a copy? Good. Okay, I appreciate we're going to have some people drifting in. Some may have to leave early, so it'll be an ongoing discussion, which again we're capturing in live stream this afternoon for those who couldn't be here in person. And please do come in, those who are joining the discussion. We have some copies of the document in hard copy we've distributed, so I'd ask if anyone is coming in and wants one just to borrow one from one of the existing people who have them, because I think we've given out the ones we brought. But of course, it's available online as well, and we want to make sure everyone has a look at the background material, the principles, the draft definition. I'm Lawrence Austin from Osgoode Hall Law School, and I'm chairing the working group here at York that the president has set up on an ad hoc basis to look into the response from York to a government directive that you'll see some of the background material in the document, but for those who are just catching up on this, it came at the end of summer from the Deputy Minister in the Ministry of Training, College, Universities, and we received it along with all the other universities without a lot of preparatory work. So we, again, have come together to understand where it's coming from and how best to respond on behalf of York, with the idea, after a preliminary scan of our existing policies and existing material from, again, other plans and other task forces, that York has had a history of pretty robust responses to free speech issues and the balancing that they give rise to in a host of different policies, some Senate policies, some presidential or board governed policies, and again across the academic and non-academic spheres of university life. And so the approach that the working group takes, and again I'm speaking on their behalf, but we've got some members of the working group here, and terrific support we're receiving from the Council's office and Secretariat. We have Maureen Armstrong and Bob Everett here. The goal is really to share with you our thinking as a working group around how this existing array of policies we think addresses the key issues put to us by government, and therefore we haven't embarked on a process to develop a policy. We've undertaken this process to gather together our existing policies, try to consolidate, synthesize, convey them in as clear a way as we can, and in one place, which of course hasn't existed. They're found, as you can see from the background document, across a whole array of places that have been approved in different eras of the university. And so we're treating this exercise as a way to convey our values, not as a way to either develop new ones or simply as a way to change any aspect of York's approach in line with or in light of this government initiative, although we take seriously that it's come with a mandatory aspect for publicly assisted universities and colleges, and we take that seriously. But in, again, the view initially of the working group, we didn't see this as an area where York has to move off of our approach. So that's what we want to hear from you on, and specifically the questions we had posed as a group on which we're hoping to get as much feedback and as divergent perspectives as we can find on campus are these three. One, the definition of free speech and draft principles that we pulled together from these existing sources. We want to make sure reflects the kinds of shared values we're aiming for. And so if you have comments on that or any aspect of it, we'd be really keen to hear. Second, are there any gaps in those existing policies that we should be alive to? Or does there need to be a process following on this one to explore some of those underlying policies and take a new look at it? So our mandate, for example, isn't to rewrite the policy on temporary use of space, but it may well be that we recommend some process ought to be undertaken to revisit that use of space in light of new challenges, new approaches that we're hearing from. So we're a listening post as much as we are trying to gather together and make recommendations based on what we're finding. And third, what tools, information, resources, could be guidelines, could be kits for those who want to engage in protest. What are the appropriate ways and resources to draw on in wanting to express dissent and wanting to participate or organize protests? We see this as, again, an opportunity in light of the fact that we're focusing on free speech. And we've noticed other universities have resources that are available to those planning events or planning to protest events that are, in a sense, more clear and accessible than those that we have at York. So this may be an opportunity to up our game in terms of serving the community in relation to, again, what are always going to be difficult and concerning moments for a community where we want to respect each other and respect open discourse, but where there also may be important constraints because we also want to avoid harm and avoid the ways in which speech can create that harm for other members of our community. So as, again, I've been doing this background, it's terrific to see people taking of their time wanting to participate with us in this. Just to give you, before I open up the floor, one sense of our kind of process that we envision. As I said, we're set up as an advisory group to the President. We're going to come forth not as a decision-making body with our answer, but again as a recommendatory body with what we see as this existing array of policies and the ways that we think we can most clearly convey that to respond to government, but importantly to respond to our own community even more so. And then that will go to Senate and will go to the board and we'll need the approval of both to represent the kind of holistic approach we think is critical to this issue, because aspects of it relate directly to the academic program, aspects of it relate to administrative services, aspects relate to where those two both need to be involved. And we want to see something, again, that has the imprimatur to the extent it can of the whole governance of the community, not just one policy in one place at one time. So that's the exercise, and you can hear, I think, in just my introduction, some sense of wanting to be responsive first and foremost to our community, but also being on a timeline and answering certain questions that have been put to us by government. And those questions, which are set out in the document and online, include, among other things, not just that we convey our policy on free speech, but that it meet the standards of the Chicago Statement, which again is both a longish statement you can read in full, but bullet points from it were taken by the Deputy Minister in setting out what could be termed minimum standards. And there's reference to universities considering student groups and whether they're adopting free speech codes. And again, we take the mandatory requirement to consider this, and as a working group, we've found no basis to move off of York's relationship with the autonomy of student organizations or the policies that govern. So this is one of those examples where, while we're committed to continuous improvement, we see the balance we've been striking with our existing policies really as sufficient to meet this challenge. So that's the bottom line from the working group. Let me open it up with one stipulation that I request those who do want to share their views use a mic so the folks tuning in to the live stream can also hear and be able to get the benefit of your thoughts. And I also have a mic I can pass around if that's more convenient. So with that, let me invite the comments to begin, and I'm happy to clarify anything I can around the work of the group as well if it's going to be helpful. And our first comment from the center mic, and we also have mics on both ends of the room.
VP Campaigns of YUGSA, York University Grad Student Association. I wanted to touch on 3 quick points. One is that in the policy draft that we have, it says that free speech will be limited by York's commitment to anti-racism.
Right.
And I wanted to know basically who defines, at York, who defines racism, and what is the office that would police breaches of our commitment to anti-racism. So that's point 1. Point 2 is similar, but in reference to this idea that protest cannot significantly disrupt another event where free speech is, being exercised. And again, what is the office who polices York's definition of significant interference? And the third point is actually an ask. Talking with the fellow YUGSA executive, we've come up with an ask that there is a very clear summary released before this policy is approved. And the summary would detail exactly what is different in both the policy and the plans for enforcement or implementation between our current, as you said, conglomeration of policies and this consolidated one. That summary would be very helpful, I think, for the community.
For sure. And first of all, thank you for those comments. They're important ones. Let me just start at the end. Certainly, we're asking about gaps. We're open to the argument that our existing policies don't, in fact, strike the appropriate balance or the necessary one to respond to this request, more than a request, this mandate from government to have a free speech policy conveyed. Again, our starting proposition is that there would not be a deviation from our existing policies. And I take your point also just as an opening to say we recognize that the policy language is not always what's most important to people. It is, as you said, how is it interpreted? How is it applied? Where are the guidelines around what is and isn't going to be considered meeting that terminology around racism, for example, in the policy on racism that York has adopted, and who gets to make those calls and again, in what kind of transparency. I should add the other part of the mandate is to have an annual report where this is tracked and presumably have some transparency around how each university is adapting to their implementation of these policies, and that will be an important aspect that will be new for York. We don't now produce such an annual report. So I'm not suggesting there won't be anything new coming out of this. But again, I think to answer that last point first on behalf of the committee, we've not yet identified any area that we would recommend moving off of York's existing policies in response. We take the view that not only the Chicago principles, but additional ones in York's own values are met by this balance. I mean, I could turn to Maureen a little bit on the first question, because I think it's a question around how the administration of some of these policies work. If there's a complaint under the policy on racism, for example, there's clearly sources of expertise and governance attached to each of the policies. That is to say, each policy is housed somewhere in the university that has responsibility over its enforcement or monitoring. But I don't know if there's more, Maureen, at this point you want to say on this. And maybe I could borrow the mic just for a moment and I'll bring it right back to you. Oh, hang on, we've got an extra one, so you hang on to this one. Sorry. Oh, it's okay, I've got it here. There we go. I'm going to put it over here. Thanks. Perfect. So Maureen, do you want to take an initial stab at an answer to that?
Sure, thanks, Lauren. Just really briefly, You'll appreciate it's coming from a lawyer, but I think the answer is that depends, because the policy depends, and it depends on the context within which something occurs. So, for example, the policy on racism applies equally to students, faculty, and staff. If there's a concern that there's been a breach, that there's been racist conduct as a result of some exercise of free speech, if the individual who feels aggrieved is an employee, they may want to exercise various rights that they have either under a collective agreement or under workplace harassment policy and program. So I don't think there's a singular answer, that there's a singular office. I think it's a point well taken to have as much clarity as possible as to who makes the decision on those various elements when they come about.
Yeah, and I take that point also as an encouragement for the committee to give some thought to thinking through, if we're going to link to these existing policies, should we also have links to process, procedure, any interpretive approaches that have been taken in the past that would be helpful for people, or to encourage those to be developed, is again, point very well taken. And ambiguity and vagueness, again, may not be helpful as we try to plan our actions on the basis of this.
First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for having this, because I think it's really important that we all have our voice and that we all can say our views, and I really appreciate having us being consulted, number one. Number two, I just want to say a concern that I have is that we have a repeat of the Lindsay Shepherd saga, or the Jordan Peterson saga that went on because you know, he rightly said things about free speech, and I just want to make sure that, you know, like, how are we gonna make sure that things like that aren't gonna happen on this campus? Meaning, people can say what they want to say as long as it's not, you know, hate speech. But the issue with that is, how do you define that? Because a lot of people have different different views on that. So I was just wondering what.
No, absolutely. It's in fact, I have to say, it's a discomforting thought for me, as I'm sure it is for many. I think the only appropriate response is to say we shouldn't expect it won't happen here. We should, in fact, develop these policies with the view in mind that they will exactly be tested in those kinds of settings. And it may be in a classroom, it may be with an event, but I think in this atmosphere that we're living in, the point of these policies won't be to prevent any moment like that, but to prevent the rest of what happened. That is to say, a lack of having an appropriate process, lack of respect for the roles that different parties were playing, and a whole bunch of other things that I think all universities have learned coming out of that experience, just as York has had issues over its history that became touchstones for other universities too. So I think we would be wrong not to learn from those experiences. We won't replicate them in the same way, but I think those challenges will happen at a school as vibrant, diverse, and large as York. So we should expect these policies to be adaptable, resilient, to be able to work in the face of those kinds of settings. And in terms of where those definitions will come from, again, the working group has been looking at different approaches. One approach would be to take examples in a kind of commentary style document and say, based on these policies, based on our understanding, here's what would happen if this occurred or that occurred, to try to give some concreteness, some reality check, because just listening to the words at 18,000 feet, they are going to be easily agreed upon by many. When you see the application of them is when you start to see the real values underlying them.
So I 100% agree with you on that. Sorry if that wasn't clear. I didn't mean to say that I never think that it's going to happen, and I just wanted to make sure that it was going to be somewhat toned down in that sense. But I also just wanted to add one quick point
Sure.
on that, which is, would it not be helpful to talk to people who have actually been through those experiences, that have been denied their right to free speech and free expression? Because it's one thing to consult people like us, and you know, we might have experiences or certain people might have experiences, but it's not the same as like someone who's actually like lived through that situation. So I was just wondering if that's also on the table of something
No,
that
it's
might
a,
happen.
it's a really helpful point, and I can certainly speak on behalf of the working group that we're looking for those kinds of first-person perspectives. Again, sometimes we can get them because some of the people involved have done some writing themselves about their experience, but talking to people and being able to have that conversation who've been subject to a direct impact in that way would be very, very helpful. And I appreciate the encouragement, and again, I think it's exactly what we need to hear in order to make sure we're getting as full a picture as we can then convey. Because again, I see this group not as the body that will decide these matters. That will be Senate and the board. But we want to make sure we're presenting as full a picture as we possibly can. So very much appreciated.
Hi there.
I can take that.
First of all, good afternoon. My name is Noam Yakutiel Siboni. I'm the president of Students for Free Speech at York University.
Then you're in the right place.
Yeah, I thought so. So to speak to Sahara's point, actually, I wanted to first thank you on behalf of my family who fled North Africa and Nazi Germany for the exact reasons that we stand here today, to support freedom of speech, and that I'm a first-generation university student, and I'm very proud of the fact that the working group has put in so much effort to be diligent and mindful of both the law, combating hate, and upholding the right to freedom of speech. So I had one point of precedent that I thought would be very important for the working group to be aware of. It happened last year, and I'll explain it as concisely as I possibly can. So last year, the York Federation of Students had an annual general meeting in which a motion was presented by several students called the Motion on Fighting the Far Right. It included, quote, "Be it further resolved that if a far-right speaker is invited to speak on campus, that the YFS organize mass mobilizations of students, workers, and marginalized communities to shut down the far right." Additionally, be it further resolved that the YFS provides support, including financial, for student activist groups fighting against the far right. Based on my family history and history here in Canada, I absolutely sympathize and share the sentiments against hate. I think hate is egregious and we should fight it with freedom of speech. Now, our concerns with this motion were, what do we define as the far right?
Right.
And that we should amend shut down to protest. These concerns ended up being overturned with the response, quote, "If we aren't trying to shut it down, why protest at all?" Which essentially suggests that the aim is to stifle free speech, not to arrange oneself peacefully to protest. Here are the concerns we had after it was passed by the YFS for the upcoming year. Far right was finally defined as, quote, "groups that openly espouse verbal, mental, and physical violence against racial, religious, sexual minorities, leftists, and women activists." Our concerns were as follows, and not just ours, but many students in the room during this AGM. What does emotional or mental violence entail? And because of this motion, the YFS is now mandated to use its resources and funds to shut down, specifically shut down, events and speakers invited to campus, which seems to violate the free speech policy we're trying to put in place here. I understand that the two entities of the administration and the YFS are often separated when it comes to dealings. However, in this case, they may certainly come into conflict. So my question was, does the working group have a plan of how to deal with this conflict between the York Federation of Students and the administrative bodies?
No, first of all, thank you for sharing that exchange, and I think it goes to the heart of what we're wrestling with, because I want to give some validation to both those perspectives, because I feel both those perspectives. I feel that sense of wanting to prevent the university from being a place for the espousal of hate, and I feel that sense of not wanting to be in the position of being the arbiter of who gets to speak and who doesn't, especially when they're attempting to meet those who share views and want to hear from an individual, or those who don't share views and want to better understand where that's coming from. So I think in terms of resolving that particular conflict, again, we look to the autonomy of student organizations within frameworks that the university has set up to govern, and having the vote carry the day, having dissenting views to the vote expressed, and as you said, speaking in ways that resonated with many students, finding mechanisms should it come to acting on that. That is to say, if any student group or any group of your community members attempt to shut down in whatever form that takes an event that is otherwise complying with all the policies we're speaking of, we'll again press on how resilient and effective those policies are, because certainly in the context that we've been reviewing use of space, inviting guests, things like that, if a student group invites someone, if there's a classroom that has a guest, these are all occasions when interfering with that right of the community to hear from individuals would be engaged, and also where the right to protest, up to and including being heard. Now, and again, it's interpreting what disruptive and ongoing, and we've heard already the challenges with that language, but I think it's exactly right that if we can't do justice to those members of a group, let's say, who have invited a speaker and expect to have these policies protect them, and if we can't do justice to YFS or other groups that are looking to these policies to promote and preserve that right to dissent and to protest, then these policies aren't effective. How we're going to navigate those shoals and how we're going to honor this in the breach in that kind of setting is going to take a lot of reflection and a lot of community work and a lot of respecting each other and disagreeing on some key features, but realizing that we're a community that's going to live and work together. So I don't want to presume how that's going to run, but that's exactly how we're envisioning these policies are going to need to work. It's not that they can be put aside because of a vote of an organization, but we're also, I think, wrong if we don't take seriously those votes, where they're coming from, what that community is trying to say with a motion like that. So I know it's not a completely satisfactory answer, but it's hitting exactly where the working group feels so thoughtfully engaged in trying to do justice to those different passionate parts of our community.
Thank you very much for your response.
Please.
Hi, folks. My name is Sebastian Lalonde. I am the Vice President Campaigns and Advocacy from the York Federation of Students.
Great.
So there are just a few things that we wanted to highlight, specifically when reading over the draft policy. And the first one are just some of the issues that we see with the overall, not just the policy, but the directive that was brought forward from the government. The first one is just the idea of the freedom of assembly directly contradicting the freedom of expression and the way that that is kind of outlined within the directive. And it doesn't actually show up very much in our policy, which I'm a little bit confused as to how we plan on navigating that when presenting this to the government, considering that clause isn't necessarily touched upon. Which, I mean, personally, I agree with, and we see it as contradictory anyway to talk about the idea that the definition of freedom of expression violates the right to assembly. Does that make sense?
It does. We wouldn't be very Canadian if we didn't embrace contradictions, but I take the point that that does need to be elaborated more clearly than it perhaps is at the moment in the document.
Right. The second thing is the idea of how this will actually impact student unions, clubs, and students. As it stands, we actually have the Student Code of Rights and Responsibilities, which we've already seen being used to penalize certain students for actions on this campus time and time again. And we're simply afraid that this policy is only going to further demonize students on campus and be used against these students even further whenever it comes to speaking out about things that they don't necessarily agree with. And so, again, it's kind of seeing this contradiction of freedom of expression being impeded upon for students who are trying to express their opinions. And that's something that isn't really addressed in the policy, and how we're actually going to navigate allowing students the freedom to be able to speak and the freedom to protest while also protecting those students and their interests. There seems to be a lack of balance there. And the very last thing that I wanted to highlight was the fact that, once again, one of the issues that the York Federation of Students consistently sees with this and this working group is, although the consultations are great, there's still a lack of the union's representation on the deciding body for the writing of this policy, especially when those student unions are the ones who are going to be directly affected by this directive. Student unions need a space on this working group, on the deciding factor that is going to decide whether or not this policy is coming into play, and in future negotiations.
No, I appreciate that point, and again, it's been raised, I think, in a consistent way by a number of student representative bodies, and while the group itself has not taken carriage of the composition of the group. It's obviously advisory to the president. We can't speak to the choices that are made. We do reiterate, at least from looking at the composition, that the membership hasn't been representative in that sense of groups or organizations. So while there is a student who's joining us today, it's not in a representative capacity. And again, I hear and appreciate the reasons why student organizations or others on campus would see it as appropriate that representative bodies be on this group. Again, what I can say is we don't view it as a deciding body. It will be for Senate and the board to make decisions. But I also don't want to downplay the importance of having the pen in drafting what comes before those bodies, deciding again in this array of policies that we're putting together. This morning someone I think appropriately noted that what got excerpted in the Code of Rights and Responsibilities or the Human Rights Code are important choices being made, whether well-intentioned or not, that are going to signal things to the community about what's most important. And I take that very much as a cautionary note in the work of the group, because it doesn't have the benefit at the moment of that representation. But I think that criticism has been conveyed, is duly noted, and I see it as coming from an important place around how significant these issues are to students. The last thing I'd say is obviously we know this is happening at a time when there's been a lot of coverage of specific disciplinary matters, which of course the working group isn't privy to, can't address in terms of specific cases, but we're alive to how the interpretation and application of the code is what matters. It's not necessarily just the wording that's going to be significant for us as a community. So we've got to find a way to ensure that whatever comes out of a statement of policy, that we convey how much the community is alive to the concern. So having clarity, whether through guidelines, whether through further consultations on the code itself, we know there needs to be further work. And that's always the worry in saying our existing template is sufficient, is to somehow come across as saying the status quo is good enough and we're all fine. I don't think anyone's suggesting to us we're all fine, nor are, again, many people in the community saying we ought to abandon the policies that have been through our governance in response to a directive from government, even if we respect the face value of what the government is mandating us to do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There's just one last thing I wanted to highlight. One of the gaps that I think we've definitely seen, and that actually speak a lot to the example that the speaker before me had talked about. One thing that we don't really concentrate a lot on in the draft policy, I find, is the safety of students and community members. Yeah. We don't talk enough about assuring the safety of those members, both mentally, both physically, and within an educational environment. And that is essentially why, for example, the YFS last year had passed that motion in order to ensure the safety of the students and the people who attend this campus, so that they would never be harmed when it comes to those different capacities. That's something that within this policy I think should definitely be highlighted, the idea of safety of our students, regardless of which side of the coin you happen to be on when it comes to a debate, simply assuring that their mental health, their well-being is being taken care of when these debates actually happen. And it's something that I don't think we talk about often enough when it comes to freedom of speech.
No, I think it's a really important point. Thank you for emphasizing it.
Thank you.
And hang on, do you want to... hang on, let me give you the mic. No, that's...
I wanted to add to this. So I completely agree with you that the last person who just spoke, I agree that there does need to be safety on the one hand, but on the other hand, it does say in the Chicago Principles that people have to kind of go with ideas that they're not comfortable with or that they don't like. So it's also about finding that balance between like something really egregious or something versus that you're just not comfortable with. So it's kind of tiptoeing that line of where am I going, what's happening here, is this really bad, or can I can we deal with this in a different way, sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think certainly you're looking at the existing policies, you see time and time again really creative attempts to avoid juxtapositions that are binary, that this is either freedom of assembly or freedom of speech. It's either the event is on or the event is off. There's enormous consistency across policies in trying to find other solutions that do try to address legitimate concerns from divergent parts of the community. The answer is obviously sometimes a very murky and muddled middle ground that's not satisfactory to many, but I'd say that is a theme that we need to be alive to, is not making it just about this or that binary kind of situations, and that's of course something we're looking for help in working through. So let me turn now again, talking through some of the critiques and suggestions we've had from student organizations, and it's been great to benefit in many ways already from some dialogue, and look forward to more.
My name is Aaliyah Kareem, and I'm the president of the York University Graduate Students Association. I have many questions because I do find this to be controversial, as you know already, because I've already asked you questions. I do want to make it clear that the YUGSA will not stand for hate. We know that there's groups, white supremacist groups, groups that I think qualify as expressing hate, and they're interested in organizing on this campus. If not, they're organizing already. They may not have an official club status, right? But there are groups that some of us know have been putting up posters specifically about white supremacy, and I don't want to name this group. I have their information. I don't want to give attention to them, but we're really concerned that they have, for example, released videos saying that they're looking forward to this free speech policy to protect their activities on campus. And I still haven't gotten an answer from, different, I guess you could say consultations groups already who are talking about this. What does York University do about these white supremacist groups, like already in our existing policies? Because it's not clear to me who is making the decision on what qualifies as hate. To me, and to YUGSA, it absolutely does qualify as hate, and we will not tolerate that. We will not give these people spaces or our resources. We will not allow for the hatred of groups, based on their perceived race, class, religion, status, etc., right? So I want to make that clear. I have some questions about the process, and we've already brought up the composition of the working group. So our former president of YUGSA, Mina Rajabi, brought up on the October 4th, the Senate Community Forum. She said directly to President Lenton, she had criticisms basically of the free speech policy and of the working group, and said, you can strike a committee with student union representatives, but instead the university, well, I guess President Lenton specifically, has decided to appoint people. We only have one student on this working group and no one from student unions, which we find very problematic, right? We've asked time and time again, I think it's 3 times now, we asked at that Senate Community Forum, we asked at the Student Representative Roundtable, and I asked at FGS Council last week, why is President Lenton, I suppose, why she decided not to have any student union representatives? This is undemocratic. Do you have a response to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly the response from the working group is to recognize that we don't speak in that sense for representative bodies. So we have some links to these issues, whether by reason of some of our academic work or other connections, but we see the Senate and board decision-making and deliberative process as where the decision will be made, which of course does have involvement and representation from student groups and other groups. So we, in a sense, see the role of the working group not in that deciding capacity. Now, that's not an answer to why the composition is what it is. So I again, take on board, take seriously, and see as important to convey concerns around the composition. But as I said, I can't speak for the president or all of the rationales that have gone into this, although I can say it is very challenging to know which of the many important representative groups would be most important to hear from, in a sense, relative to others. So having some mechanisms for all the groups who have an interest and have something important to say to ensure that their voice is reflected in the outcome, we take very seriously as a working group, which is why the forms that are being uploaded, we now have over 45 different written responses. These events, the online one to come on Thursday, we don't see as window dressing or just an exercise in hearing ourselves speak. We really do bring good faith and integrity to a collegial and collaborative process. That's not the same as having those voices around the table, but I also don't think it's insignificant. It's instead, I think, a heightened expectation that the working group will genuinely reflect some of those critical voices as well, and not just pick and choose the voices that are convenient
Yeah,
to
but
hear
you could
from.
still do that. Ultimately, like the working group is making decisions on this policy and what the draft is going to be, right? So you are making decisions on that, and we're very disappointed that, again, the president has appointed certain individuals for certain reasons, and how can we not interpret this as a political decision, right? She was, Mina spoke about this before the composition of the working group was decided upon, and the president decided to ignore that, to not have any student union representatives, when in the government mandate it says things, about student unions in particular, right? And, to encourage universities to tie our funding and recognition as student unions to this free speech policy. So that's why we're really concerned about this, and President Lenton hasn't given us a clear answer about why she appointed certain people to be on this working group. It is totally undemocratic. We know that this is going to come to Senate, right? Senate is going to have an approval or I guess some kind of motion on this. I find that, that may be a step in the good direction, but, looking at the events of the strike, there's a lot of complications with Senate, and Senate not being able to make the decision, not the, Senate executive and board of governors that are different groups in a sense, but the full Senate not being able to make the decision about whether classes should continue during the strike or not. So we can say, sure, we're going to run this by Senate. Is Senate going to be able to make amendments and changes to the draft policy? Because my understanding is that ultimately is going to be up to the working group. So that's why this is so problematic.
Yeah, and I think there is was a good question this morning again around the role of Senate, and certainly this will be a motion with the attached draft once it's prepared based on these consultations. Senate will absolutely, in its normal course, as I understand again from the discussion this morning and Maureen's helpful clarification, will have that ability to look at the text, look at each phrasing of it, but the working group's view is that this is not a mandate to develop new policy. So the concern I would have is if we were going to develop new policy, there ought to be a far broader and deeper process to do that. What I wouldn't want to see, and again, it's not that Senate doesn't have the jurisdiction or the authority, but in terms of how it's appropriate to develop these kinds of shared values and voices, if new aspects that are changing existing policies or deviating from those policies, which again is our remit, is to express those policies, if instead it's let's deviate or change them, then I would say this is not a great process to result in new policy being made or changes to existing policy. We may call for example, the Code of Student Rights and Responsibilities to be subject to a process going forward, but this isn't a process, again, that is set out to make new policy or deviate from existing. It's looking at how to convey that, how to synthesize it, address and bring to the surface any gaps we find. But again, I can speak to all the working group members with whom I've spoken, see their accountability as to the York community. No one is looking at this as just a place to understand what a party line is or a view of one group or another and toe that line. That's not why any of us are doing this. So, that kind of appeal to collegial trust doesn't address the genuine concerns I know you've expressed, which I hope you hear that I respect.
I know, my frustration is more with President Lenton because she appointed this working group.
No, I hear you, but I do think it's important for the community to understand the working group, with all those imperfections in the eyes of many around composition, are going about this for that reason, not going about this in official capacities because we're looking at a particular university or administration view on these issues. We're developing that ourselves and then putting it to the collegial bodies to decide if it does resonate or not, and Senate.
And so what if it doesn't resonate?
And if it doesn't,
what does that mean?
If
What
it
does it
doesn't-
mean if Senate doesn't
Right.
approve this?
If it doesn't approve it, then we have to look at the reality of the need to convey something to government, the need to be true to our own governance. So if we don't have a policy statement that can be approved, then Senate itself would no doubt have a voice in, as a motion was put to it, let's say that didn't pass, Senate would expect to hear what happens next. And at that point, it's not the working group's role, but for the university to speak to it. And I have no doubt, again, the leadership of the university will have to consider all those contingencies and be ready in real time to respond, because the government's mandate is that we have an answer by the end of calendar year that meets their standards. So again, you're raising an important point. It's one the working group needs to be alive to, but not one the working group itself can resolve.
And when exactly will no draft has been released. It's just the principles and some information
That's
about
right.
the working group. So when will the actual draft policy be released?
So our consultations will conclude at the beginning of next week, and I should add we're also hearing from faculty councils and other bodies that are deliberating this week and will be sharing views. The drafting will take place in time. Maureen, when is Senate Executive going to need to see that first draft? Is that the first deadline we'll come to?
Yeah, the Senate executive will see it later next week, and then it would go presumably into Senate for the 22nd
Thank you.
of November.
So that would be the timeline. So all, in other words, within the next 2 weeks.
I mean, I have other questions, but I don't want to take up space, so.
Well, why don't we hear from some more, but consider it a placeholder to come back, because I do want to make sure everyone's comments or questions get heard and addressed, and I appreciate those very much.
Hi, I'm Shoshana Pasternak. Can you hear me?
Maybe talk a little closer to the mic.
I'm Shoshana Pasternak.
Hi.
I'm the president of Campus Conservatives at York University. I'd first like to commend the administration on organizing this consultation. This is a great start to making meaningful change to York University's free speech policy. The Campus Conservatives at York University are very proud of our Premier, Doug Ford, and the Government for the People for mandating all universities in Ontario to uphold free speech. Conservatives believe universities should be a place for education, a place where young adults can learn to think for themselves and have opinions challenged. Colleges and universities are places where ideas matter and opinions should be expressed freely. This is about respect and responsible debate. Unfortunately, universities are now often a place where free speech goes to die, as events are regularly shut down by perpetually offended protesters. I would like to bring two suggestions forward today. Okay. One, that York University clubs must not be charged exorbitant security fees against their consent for holding events. And number two, students have the right to protest, but may not prevent events from being held through disruption, impede movement on campus, or interfere with university operations. Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing those thoughts. And again, to the extent that we're receiving some as comments, I want to again give thanks to Bob and Maureen, who are trying again to keep track of all the suggestions, and we have the live stream that will be captured as well. So welcome the comments and suggestions, and know that that will also be factored into the discussions to come. So thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Stuart Schuessler. I'm one of the York students who's currently undergoing a punitive reprisal process brought forth by the university for legal acts of freedom of expression taken on and off campus. I'd like to reiterate what a number of people have said, in that, number one, from what I read here, your treatment of hate speech is very impoverished and needs a lot more development. I think that we have to consider the situation that we live in today, where, for example, there was a massacre at a mosque in Quebec City. A year ago? We see violent attacks, people being killed in the United States, and all around we see institutions such as the University of Toronto or the Munk Center giving a platform to people who express white nationalist, Islamophobic, extremely misogynist, and a range of other opinions. And by making these mainstream, it makes it more acceptable for the sort of violent acts that we see happening every day more and more. I know that I speak for a number of people at York University when I say that we will not allow someone like Faith Goldy, who is an avowed white nationalist, to speak on this campus, because giving a mainstream platform to a person like that gives protection to people who carry out acts of violence, and it's happening all around us, and we can't act like this is just some neutral debate about legalistic terms when there are things happening and people are losing their lives. I would also like to say, so number one, hate speech, you need to develop a definition of that. Number two, when I see the way that freedom of expression is treated here, it's frequently in a negative manner, that freedom of expression has limits. There is very little attention to how the fullness of freedom of expression will be embraced, and that is something that, from my personal experience, and those of us who are being reprised against for legal acts of freedom of expression, that this university needs. We see that the conduct of student rights and responsibilities is being wielded in a punitive manner by the administration in order to take action against people who, as workers on strike, a legal strike, were engaged in strike actions, and now trying to pursue us as students. So if this policy is going to be used to further strengthen the university's ability to go after students for this sort of peaceful protest, then this policy does not have my consent. And I would like to note that the Code of Student Rights and Responsibilities, they also had consultations like this, and now they say that the code has community consent because there were a couple meetings. Right. The fact that I'm here and the fact that everybody else is here does not mean that we support the policy that you all are writing. In fact, I would like to second the very legitimate concerns about a lack of involvement of many different groups. I know you're going to say that the Senate is the place that this will be decided upon, but the process by which it's written matters. And the fact that there aren't students who are part of the process and there aren't people representing all the range of voices around York University in this process matters. So I would just like to make it clear that you'll have my consent when there is a process that protects freedom of expression and our right to peaceful protest that takes a hard line on hate speech, and when those things are actually implemented in a consistent way, because we've seen with the Code of Student Rights and Responsibilities that the university takes extreme liberty to disregard whatever parts of this code it feels like it should. I could give you a laundry list from my personal experiences of all the ways they're violating their own process just so that they can come after people. And I don't want this to be another policy that allows those sorts of things to happen. The last thing I'd like to say is there are a number of people in line, and I think that they should all have their chance to speak. We only have a half hour left.
Exactly. No, and so I think, as you said,
help make that happen, I'd appreciate it.
The comments speak for themselves. They're very much appreciated, and we take all of them seriously, especially the one that says coming out and sharing your views here is not the same as condoning or supporting the process or the document. It's important for us to hear, but I think that is worth underscoring. Certainly not how I understand it, and it won't be how we represent it in talking about these important discussions.
Hi, Lauren. We spoke this morning, so I promise I won't take up too much time. I wonder if I could just ask the room, if you're a student at York, can you just raise your hand? Graduate student, undergraduate student, full-time, part-time, just have a note of all that.
Yeah.
And then I want to echo what our friends were saying earlier about the lack of student voices in drafting this policy. Our friend John over here was appointed by the president to be the voice of 65,000. How many people go to the school? 55,000 people. Maureen said earlier that we've had 45 of the MAT forms filled out, 45 out of 55, 60,000.
Yeah.
And so I just want to echo that this will overwhelmingly impact students. This isn't a thing that's going to be used largely in terms of faculty and staff and things like that. This will be a policy that will be used against students and is being used against students. I'm another one of the student members of the community who's being reprised after the strike for legal strike actions, peaceful protests, tweets, things like that. Yeah, and so one of the things I will propose to you is just a solution. There's a little bit of hand-wringing that's going on. I didn't appoint the working group. I understand the limits of that. It's a bit over your pay grade, but it's like, what can you do? And this is what you can do. So there are policies like the YFS policy. UCSA has their own statements. The unions on campus that have elected members, right? The community itself elects these people. They are accountable. They pass motions at their meetings. They all have language in their collective agreements, in their motions, in their own statements from their groups and their agendas. They all have language that could be used to inform your policy. And I know you do it in one instance where you talk about academic freedom, right? And so I think that that's an instance where maybe we can find an inroad. And that seems to be, I think you point to a number of the unions on campus and their terms around academic freedom. But I would encourage you to also look into those collective agreements, also look to the student union motions about the specific language on definitions of discrimination. definitions of harassment, things that are and aren't allowed. These are policies on campus, right? They may not come from the top down, but they are policies that the university has signed on to in the instance of unions, and they can inform your policy in the exact ways that the students in this room seem to be asking you to do. And I would encourage you, when you do go back, before you bring it to Senate, to put some of that language in, to read those things. The lack of any voice of that outside of the specific, academic integrity or academic freedom is telling, right? And so we were talking about this earlier in terms of editing. That's one of those moments where we're watching that and we're seeing a selective choice of when our voices get to be heard and when our voices aren't. And it seems to be administration defining the very principles of this, and we're sort of an addendum, an appendix upon the side, and then often not even involved in the conversation. So that's maybe a more productive version of what I was saying
appreciate
earlier.
both the suggestion and the underlying thoughts and building on this morning. So very much appreciated. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Priyank Desai. Is that fine? Yeah. I'm a political science student here at York. I'm with Students for Free Speech. First of all, I want to start off by thanking you guys for holding this consultation. It's it's a great exercise in freedom of expression and assembly here at York, and having gone through the policy, happy to see that this mandate has been taken seriously and that we actually York actually cares about upholding students' right to freedom of speech. I just wanted it to be noted that there were some concerns about democracy, and this policy didn't come out of nowhere. It comes from a democratically elected provincial government that has a majority in Parliament. It was something that they ran on and something that has now come through. And additionally, I just have a few questions. If there was questions raised earlier. Points raised earlier about departments and unions within the university having rules that contradict the Chicago principles. If the York administration is not able to have a say in those being changed, and the law is then being broken, would the provincial government is looking to do monetary penalties? So would those penalties go to York or to the YFS or to any other union? Although end of the day, it is still coming out of our student tuition fees.
Right.
And finally, in terms of penalties for disrupting events, what would that sort of entail, and what are we looking to do? Not in terms of just penalties for trying to shut down events and not peacefully protest, which is something that's covered by this. What steps have been taken to prevent it, not just penalizing it every time, but prevented it from happening in the future. And I would add that finally that I think the protest kit is a great idea and makes things a lot more clear. So,
Super.
thanks.
And just a very quick answer to the two questions. One, again, we don't see this mandate as one that requires student groups to be adopting and aligning their free speech policies to the Chicago Statement or to these existing university policies. We've taken the view, again, that the mandate is to consider that, and in looking at our environment with, again, all of the dissent within many of those student organizations taken seriously, we didn't see a mandate to intervene and change the existing policies governing student organizations. So we wouldn't see that as, again, contrary to the mandate, or, again, the mandate itself as requiring that of student groups. You're right that we have existing policies. There's both internal oversight and some relationship between those student groups and the university in our existing policy environment. That remains, again, something to be implemented, and if there are gaps or challenges with how that's being done, our existing policies have procedures to pursue. So I can't speak to specifics of where that it comes down in terms of what happens if there's a disruption, but our existing policies will carry us through in the eyes of the working group, notwithstanding the clear messaging from government. And you're right, its democratic mandate is being used clearly as something that underlies this. This didn't come out of nowhere. It was part of the campaign. That's, of course, also what gives rise to real opposition of some who see this in a political kind of lens rather than something of a policy mandate. That said, we've had experience with sexual violence policy and others where the province has come up with a mandate and expected each university to respond to it. So this isn't out of the ordinary in terms of how government expects universities to be partners in its policy environments, but first time, of course, it's happened in this way. So we're alive to that as well and appreciate your comments.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is James Byrne, and I'm a graduate student in social and political thought and a member of a number of campus organizations. So I have 3 points, which I'll be as quick as I can,
Sure.
and they're, of course, interrelated. The first is that I appreciate the position that you're in, having been appointed to do this policy, but I'd like to echo the concerns of a lot, probably the majority of the people here, where this is, you said it's an unrepresentative body, but I think we shouldn't mince words, it's an undemocratic body. And there's a real irony in an undemocratic body deciding what a free speech policy is going to be. So, yeah, and you may not have the authority to change the composition of the working group, but you do have the ability to say to the president, we don't have the competency to draft a free speech policy, given that we are an undemocratic body. And so I would encourage you to do that. Related to that is the point on autonomy of student groups, which I'm pleased to see that you are planning to respect the autonomy of student groups, and I think that is a good way of kind of mitigating the anti-democratic nature of this procedure, but it's still not sufficient. So my other 2 points are on the political nature of this question and on the definition of speech. So I think it would be naive to think that this is not a political question. It's not a coincidence that this policy is being brought in by a conservative government, and we also have to be conscious that this question of free speech on campus has been resurgent in the last number of years. So the political elements of this question have to be considered. Like, it's not a neutral policy, and it's not, the question of the role of the university comes into question. Is the university here to be a judge? Is it here to arbitrate between different students' opinions on the matter? And my view is that no, it's not. The university's policy should be to protect the functioning of the university, and disputes between student organizations aren't really where the university should be, getting involved in. So then the question of freedom of speech, I think I'm encouraged by the excerpt you have from Irwin Toy Limited versus Quebec in the document you released, where it talks about the definition of expression, and one of the things it emphasizes is that expression has both a content and a form. Mm-hmm. And what this really gets to is, I think people referred to a contradiction between freedom of assembly and freedom of speech, but I don't see those as contradictory at all, but complementary. And it's not a coincidence that it's the same clause in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms that protects both of those. And it's also not a coincidence that the rights and responsibilities of a student document also includes both freedom of assembly and freedom of expression in the same clause, because they're both manifestations of the same core principle. And what's troubling about this, and this is the relation to the political question, is that free speech, or the term free speech, is often used to protect certain forms of expression while simultaneously attacking other forms of expression which should be covered by the same policy. So if you invite a speaker to campus and have them on front of a stage, most people would recognize that as free speech, and the people who are arguing for these policies tend to think that should be protected. However, a lot of those people are unwilling to extend that same protection to the demonstration outside in the hallways. Right. And just because students choose to adopt a different form of expression doesn't mean that it's not free speech. And there's some troubling language around harassment that's used as well, because what qualifies as harassment, and if you tell people attending an event that they are endorsing a racist speaker, is that harassment? In my opinion, that's just another expression of free speech. So, this policy, even though it's termed in the language of free speech because that's the mandate that's being given to us by Doug Ford, it doesn't mean that the university has to ignore the question of assembly. And so I think the university should tackle these both to an equal degree in the drafting of the policy.
Well, I appreciate that thoughtful reaction to the draft very much, and the underlying views. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Lena Nasser. I'm a student here at York. So I won't sort of go over the same things people have already said, but I do want to ask a question that I think still requires a lot of explaining, and that's the relationship between free speech and material support, because clearly a lot of what this policy seems to be doing is talking about providing space, providing, somebody mentioned providing security, all of these things under the guise of free speech. And I think that that needs to be addressed. I'm not sure why. Actually, as students, we should consent to providing space at no cost, security at no cost to groups who espouse hate and to espouse obviously very insidious views. A lot of what's going on here and a lot of the examples given in the guiding principles seem to draw on this idea that, you know, providing people space to speak at the university is sort of the both content and form of free speech that we're focusing on, while there seems to be an absence of all the others, and of course other people have said that. But so what are the decisions that went into choosing those 5 guiding principles, and what is the relationship that, or what is sort of the position that this working group is taking on this relationship between free speech and material support?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And again, responding to the last speaker as well, we actually did feel as a working group that we're not able with our mandate to develop new policies. So as I was saying earlier, those 5 principles are drawn from that existing array of policies, including, for example, the temporary use of space policy that also speaks to there being a cost if there's risks that are determined to attach themselves to an event that require additional security, for example. There can be costs associated with these events. So they're not always, in other words, free of charge if there are more than the usual costs associated with it. So the existing policies we have try to do at least some work in understanding distinctions of that nature. We as a working group look to those policies in drawing the principles out. So we didn't come up with principles, again, out of our collective views or out of thin air, but from what we saw in what are, 10, 15 different policy documents and some planning and, in some cases, department or faculty specific, in other cases, university-wide guidelines on the academic side. So we tried our best to synthesize principles out of that existing set of policies, and again, which speak to material support in some ways, but arguably not in as direct or full a way as you're suggesting, which may well be important as a go-forward initiative to explore.
Sure. I just want to re-emphasize though that in those guiding principles the sort of focus on providing space and providing rooms seems to be what was chosen over other forms.
No, for sure. And again, the contingency there is where other policies are met. So, for example, if the policy on racism or sexual violence or other policies are not met, then it doesn't translate into an entitlement to get access to that space free of charge or other things like that. So these policies don't exist in isolation. They're part of, again, a network of ways of understanding open discourse and its limits at the university. So it would, for example, be precisely relevant to say if an event is happening using space that contravenes the policy on racism, how do those policies live together becomes a challenge for the university. It can't be that the policy on racism is set aside because someone's booked a room. So we need to, again, be alive to how these live together. Thank you.
Hey. So you've made it clear when people have brought up issues with sort of either this document or York's existing policies that it's actually not your working group's job to develop a robust policy, right? You're sort of interpreting your job as just to amalgamate the policies that we already have, which have been told to you by the Senate are adequate. So that's fine. If that's your mandate, that's fine. But then you guys are holding all these consultations, and I just want to know, is there going to be a list of gaps that have been identified to you guys, provided to us at some point? Is that list going to go in front of Ronna Linton? Are you going to provide a list of suggestions that we've given you about how best to address these gaps? Because those are 2 of your mandates
no, I think
2 and 3.
It's an absolutely great question, by the way. I'll get to it when you're done, but it's absolutely right to address that here.
Right, because I want to know that the minute takers are actually taking down all these gaps that needs to be addressed, and and considerations about how to actually address them. Because people are asking you, like, how is York's commitment to anti-racism actually going to interact with its free speech policy? People are asking about like the representation on the working group on this consultation process and how low the numbers are compared to how many students we have, all that kind of stuff, right?
That's
and
right.
I just want to know that like you're not just going to erase this consultation, which happens almost every time a consultation actually happens, and that we will be able to see that you heard our concerns, and also that the Senate will be able to see that we have actually given you quite a long list of sort of concerns to be addressed. And secondly, I'm a teacher of political science. I'm glad to see there are some political science students here today. I just do want to remind people, Doug Ford did not get a majority of votes. He got a plurality of votes. He barely managed to get 40%. So he's not representing actually the majority of Ontarians. So just so we're all clear on that.
No, very welcome, again, expectations you're bringing on transparency in this process, and we take those seriously as a working group, and we may not opine on the nature of Premier Ford's mandate, but we will very much opine and give responses to the concerns and criticisms and suggestions and ideas that we're hearing. And I think it's right for you to expect, if you take the time to share them, whether in written form or here, that what you'll get back is meaningful, substantive, and has an impact in shaping some of what then forms the statement of policy. And no doubt if that weren't the case, then that would come up at Senate and at the board, as it should, as a deficiency in this process. So we seek to be held to that standard. It's the right approach to bring, and again, we're going to do everything we can to live up to it. I appreciate that.
Hi again. So I wanted to speak on feedback as well as gaps and tools or resources that I believe may assist with the protecting of free speech on campuses. So specifically, it is said on the first page that these free speech policies are going to be meeting the government's minimum standards. So I understand that the word minimum is used for a reason, that they are minimum standards. And I want to speak on things that have actually just been mentioned regarding security costs and how the temporary use of university space office has its own guidelines with regards to security costs. Now, just to again provide context, as it may not be readily available for the working group at this time, many groups on campuses that aim to support the dissemination of ideas and freedom of speech absent of hatred have been charged egregiously high security costs to the point where the student group, which is a student group, and students aren't always known to be very wealthy, can't afford them, and thus the event is shut down before it even happens.
Right.
So I wanted to speak to the fact that even though the Office of the Temporary Use of University Space has its own guidelines, that these are only minimum standards, and that the university may actually do well to implement more than what the government is suggesting here, as long as it still, complies with the minimum standards. Because I think a lot of student groups can feel disenfranchised in being able to invite speakers that are not hateful at all, yet still get the security costs, raised to the sky, just because of the idea that the speaker may be controversial, absent of hatred or bigotry or breaking the human rights code. Right. So that was one point that I think maybe the administration would do well to provide some sort of system or working group in and of itself to deal with these concerns of security costs and making sure that these things are affordable for student groups on campus. So that might be something to look into for the future. Additionally, maybe a suggestion, because many people here have, rightfully so, brought up concerns about the government not implementing this democratically or properly, using it politically to silence people with particular viewpoints. We don't want this to happen. So making sure that this free speech policy is written properly is very important. So I was thinking one suggestion may be, when it comes to protest or what peaceful protest is defined as, I think something that would directly lead to the shutting down or the literal deplatforming of the speaker, making it so that, let's say, the people in the room cannot hear the speaker, therefore the speaker has been shut down, or the speaker is physically or otherwise brought off the stage, things like that. If any of the conduct that is exhibited by protesters leads to these sort of things, would then constitute shutting down the event, i.e. a violation of freedom of speech. So a peaceful protest should be protected, absolutely, and hatred should be fought. But as we've seen in history with historical context, freedom of speech and being able to challenge hateful ideas in front of the public, it has been the most successful way to do so. So yeah, thank you.
That's a very well taken thought. Thank you. I appreciate that. Certainly the suggestion on looking at the temporary use of space, what can we do going forward to clarify both those guidelines you refer to, and also looking at experiences that we want to learn from when the view of many in the community is we didn't get it right, or that office didn't have a full enough sense of the effect it was having in really censoring if that cost is so egregiously high, or alternatively where we should have made provisions for more security and didn't, and there was a sense of risk in those attending. I think those are all concerns we need to be alive to, so very much appreciate those thoughts. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you for yours. So, especially because of a lot of this conversation has kind of centered around a postmodern who defines what is racism or hate speech,
Right.
I want to bring up kind of my own experience of what I feel has been hate speech, why people might disagree with that, and why it's important for us to have conversations about this to advance dialogue so that we don't demonize other people, because we're all human beings and we're all trying to figure it out. So, as a Jewish student on campus, I would say that the claims that deny the Jewish right to self-determination are anti-Semitic. I would say they're anti-Semitic because they're a denial of Jewish history, both in Christian Europe and in the Arab Muslim world. The fact that I feel they're anti-Semitic because I am a Jew means I am entitled to decide what is anti-Semitic, in the same way that my Muslim brothers and sisters should be able to decide what is Islamophobic. However, given that, I understand people feel this is a complicated issue, something that needs to be talked about, with two sides of people who agree with each other, disagree with each other, and want to find out a source of action towards peace and loving and kindness. The only way we can do that is through dialogue, not by vilifying people. When we realize that dialogue is at the essence of what a peaceful conversation is about, at the essence of coming to conclusions, we can find a way to build bridges, unify, and work towards tolerance and inclusivity. Whether or not you disagree with my feelings, these are my feelings. And because of that, I want to say that free speech is at the epicenter of what it is to be an open and inclusive university campus. And it is actually a protection of everybody's rights. Thank you.
No, I appreciate that, and it's maybe a good juncture to also remind everyone, since we've been focusing so much on our own policies and our own practices, that we're also governed by those that are the laws of the province or the country, whether the Human Rights Code that again protects everyone receiving a service from the university from discrimination, or the hate speech in the criminal code provision. And we try to do, again, some justice to that in the report, but we're certainly not exhaustive on those kinds of protections. So I think your call to all of us to do better internally is also echoing some of what we need to live in terms of the values of things like the Human Rights Code in our discourse and in how we engage. Even aside from what's a violation, it's part of the culture at the university to which many have devoted considerable time and thought, of differing positions on that particular definition of anti-Semitism or those issues. So I very much appreciate that comment, and it'll again be very important for the group and the community to reflect on that. So thank you very much. Professor Wellen.
Thanks, Lauren, and thank you to the committee for holding this session. And I can't really match the eloquence of all the students who have spoken here, because despite the difference of views, it's great that this has really been, I'm the first faculty member to get up on the mic, maybe.
Yeah, it's super impressive.
I think I am. In line with that, I don't want to discuss the substance of the policy. I want to rather discuss the process, which is, and my point is related to the issue of January 1st, 2019. As we've seen in this discussion, and as pointed out in even the procedural discussions that were in the earlier section, where we talked about the collegial approval process and the discussion process, this is going to be very difficult to get a perfect policy, or a good policy, or a policy that's going to really satisfy a lot of the views in this room by January 1st. would it not be possible to be in compliance of this policy without having a final policy in place by January 1st, right? That's something that I, as I hear more and more about this discussion, and I hear more about, in my own head, questions about the final decision-making process and approval process for the policy, wouldn't it be good for us to think already up front about the possibility of a provisional policy, or a policy that's subject to revision at least, by January 1st.
I think that's a very helpful intervention, and again, one that is resonating with the working group. In other words, this timeline isn't something we've developed internally with the view that it's the best way to come up with a response, but again, been imposed as part of the direction from government that only let the community know about this in September. So again, some universities had already been working on this, Laurier in response to its events and so forth. But for the lion's share, this has been extraordinarily compressed, which again is partly why York's taken the view this could make sense if we rely on our existing policies, but less so if we're looking to really make new policy. But the idea of there being more than just a final policy delivered, there's a COU process that is trying to explore this policy among all the universities. That's the Council of Universities in Ontario. And as we learn how much give there might be and leeway others might be seeking to take in a similar position, I think it's absolutely important to bring that to Senate and the board as part and parcel of whatever comes forward. And certainly it's a welcome thought that one could have an ongoing process beyond what we're able to do in this narrow window. So I appreciate that. So just the existing people who are standing, let's hear from you. I won't give long responses so we can end more or less on time and get everyone's voice in. So Gerard, over to you.
Well, I'll try to be very brief. My name's Gerard Kennedy. I'm a PhD student at Osgoode. Professor Sawson, I'm lucky to say, is on my committee. So I'd like to thank him and the committee for doing this work. The circumstances we may be skeptical of, but can be thankless work, so I'd like to thank them all very much for doing that. Two brief comments. One, there's been three comments actually. First, I'm spending this year in the States at the University of New York, and I would like to commend everyone for their civility compared to what's happening on many American campuses. I appreciate that. Second, there's been a lot of discussion that the province might not be acting in good faith. That is entirely possible, but I'd like to say that puts even a higher call on us to respond in the best of faith if we want to say that, and I was a bit late, so I apologize if this has been said before. We can say in our response that we aren't happy with the time frame, but this is our best effort, and we're going to continue to walk through these terms. Third, there was a discussion earlier about the need for students to feel safe on campus. That's absolutely true. Clearly, if anyone is afraid to come on campus, that's problematic, and we need to address with that. If there's a legitimate fear of physical violence, then the threat needs to be removed. If the concern is of a more psychological nature, however, I'd just like to caution that there is psychological research out there. I know it's been done by people like Lenore Skenazy, Alison Gopnik, and Jonathan Haidt, that it can actually be more effective to ignore a speaker you don't like or be exposed in small doses to make the individual braver rather than simply remove the... All right then. As someone who's had mental health issues in the past, I found this helpful. Rather than simply remove the source of psychological problem.
No, I take, thank you, Gerard. I take the point very much to heart as well, that when we're dealing with, and we've heard it from a couple of students already, when we're dealing with one's own perception of one's safety and wellness, we need to value that, to take that seriously, and to find the best practices and ways to address it, which again may go beyond a policy language, but need to be part of a student-centered university culture that I hope York is very much pursuing. So very, very well spoken, and I appreciate the comments.
I mean, that last point was just so stupid. Anyway, so just little tiny bits of racism, sexism, and apologies for colonialism is better than shutting it down. Like, that's absolutely ridiculous. There's politics behind this. Like, it's being rammed down our throats by a fucking political party that has spent its entire lack of a campaign by ignoring real reporters. And like, it's like, we can't forget the politics in this. It's real, and that's the reason why we're in this situation. So I would thank you, but it doesn't really matter what you do or your committee does, because in the end, if you say something that isn't actually going to be agreed upon by the government, then they're just going to deny it, right? And the Senate executive, without any real consultation with the Senate, because we've seen that for the past year, is just going to decide upon the policy. That's the material reality that we're talking about right here. That's actually what's happening. So to say that this is undemocratic is actually, I think, an understatement. It's absolutely anti-democratic. It's not like there's consultations, but they can just be swept away when you actually make the decision on the policy anyway.
Yeah, no, I think it's important to absolutely bring a lens of both political and critique of partisanship, critique of how the university's responding, both collectively, all universities and this university. Part of the open discourse we're in fact discussing has to include giving voice to not just issues with the document or issues with the process, but issues with the premise, issues with how it's being framed, both internally and externally. And those are very much need to be part of the discussion, and I'm grateful that you've shared them.
Well, I would also like to echo Carl's point earlier that all of these critiques of this process should be a part of the report. Like, you can't just sweep away all of this and say that we consulted, because we've seen how that happens in the past, where people justify using reprisals to threaten people with expulsion from the university, in some cases deportation, because it's claimed that the whole process was consultative with the broad community, which is, it doesn't matter, because the actual consequences of it are threatening certain people's political involvements on this campus.
Well, look, I can only speak to this process, not to all those other ones, but I can tell you genuinely the reason for this consultation isn't to go around and say we consulted. And again, I think being held to that expectation, to see that in the resulting document and the resulting discussion and deliberation at Senate, at the board, is exactly the right expectation from my point of view. Okay. I appreciate that. And John, you've been spoken of, but it's only fair as we wind down to give one of the last words to you.
Yeah, so just to give a little bit of a context behind the drafting of this proposal, yeah, as you have heard, the school was given 3 months to put together a proposal with a vaguely veiled threat at the potential cutting of funding if this is not complied with. So in thinking about how this all came to be, you have to understand that this proposal needs to get done, otherwise there could be jobs on the line. There could be real people whose lives and whose careers and whose families are at stake if we do not put something together which will at least satisfy the bare minimum threshold that the provincial government has set. So yes, the process is not ideal. Yes, there are a lot of concerns, a huge number, and there is no way we can possibly address them all given this sort of time frame. What we can do, however, is try to turn this from something which, as Dean Sossin has mentioned, which was put on us, into something that we take on proactively in an effort to actually improve the dialogue around the school. As a previous speaker has mentioned, just the civility and the degree of understanding which, this has really brought on me, personally. I think this is a great start. This is a great start of a dialogue which is bound to happen as things continue down the line. So yes, this time around, the policy will not fulfill all the wants of every single person in this room. There's a lot of disagreements. There's a lot of things that everybody wants. It's impossible to get them all in there. What's important now really is that we try to put ourselves in the shoes of other people and think, what would they want this policy to be? To listen to each other and to try to put together a policy that we can all at least be proud of at this present time. So I strongly urge you all to, take a moment afterwards, speak with people you may disagree with, try to spend some time hearing their thoughts, and when you give feedback, don't just think about the people you've been speaking to who agree with you, but also think, what do these other people want? What would make them feel comfortable? What would help them accept that this policy is a step in the right direction? And yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much for that. We had said we were going to bring the discussion to a close, but I am mindful that we've got a couple of people who are at the mic, so I'd invite you again, if you haven't been heard from especially, but just I don't want to cut anyone off, so just to have a brief comment and appreciate that we are more or less at time, I would welcome the remaining folks at the mic to share their thoughts. And again, I have a deep appreciation for everyone who stepped forward to do so already today.
All right. My name is Sam. I'm a student in the math department. Short comment, maybe a little bit asinine, but we are a university. This is a place where we obey the law in some sense, but again, when a government or when an outside institution tells us that we have to behave in a certain way, I know it seems a little ironic that this is about free speech here, but even with funding on the line, this is in particular a time, or in particular a thing, which would be considered a threat to, you know, a tradition of a university as a place of intellectual independence. And people who act against this in an at least approximate civil way can view themselves as working within this tradition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and that's again a perspective we've heard resonating with many members of this community, especially in the context of this kind of policy, that there may be other precedents, doesn't necessarily speak to what open discourse and free speech mean to the university. So I appreciate that distinction as well.
Hello everyone, my name is Ilya Azari. I am a student senator and also the vice president of Students for Free Speech.
Great.
I just want to, I guess, give my thoughts very quickly on this, and I wanted to start off with a bunch of identities that I hold currently. So I'm an immigrant, I'm an ex-Muslim, and I am currently I have a bunch of mental health issues that I'm dealing with, depression, anxiety, and at one time I was very suicidal. I'm telling all this not to necessarily appeal to, you know, people's emotions or the identity politics, but just to dispel the sort of myth of dehumanizing the other side. A lot of people, when they figure out I'm part of the free speech movement, they are very quick to put labels on me. A far right, when in fact I'm on the left. A fascist, a extremist, and so on. But the reason I have joined the free speech movement is because I've had family members executed in Iran because they practiced their freedom of speech. I've had my dad imprisoned as a political prisoner for a decade, 10 years, because he practiced his freedom of expression. These issues are very deep and personal to me. And and our club is a nonpartisan club that promotes civil discourse. And when I say this, I'm talking to myself, but I hope both sides or any person on any spectrum, on any part of the spectrum on this issue can come together and actually talk about this. And I agree with John's, what he said about, you know, people actually getting together after this and talking about it. But also, I recognize that a bunch of my peers and colleagues were laughing when the comments about the current government was said. So I just thought I should say another stats, hopefully get them laughing again. So the YFS voter turnout has been 13% in the last year. That's 1/3 out of the over 50,000 students that are present. And that's actually, it had decreased from the 2016-17 year, and it has even been 9% before. I'm saying this to, you know, there's a whole lot of narrative that students, administration is the bad guy. Students themselves have issues, and we're trying to address that. I'm part of a campaign that is comprised of thousands of students, Evolve YU, to try to bring online voting to the York University campus, to improve accessibility, reduce the environmental impact that it has, and reduce the sort of ableist nature of ballot voting. A recent meeting with the YFS, who are here today, and I do commend and applaud them for talking with us, but a recent meeting was a month ago, and we hadn't scheduled any more meetings. Well, we're still waiting back to hear from them. There was a few things they wanted to get back to us. So I'm saying all this to just have the individuals that they think they are supposedly on the, they have the moral superiority, to take a good look at themselves and see, are they committing any of the things that they are arguing against? We talked about harassment. I was on the Senate last year. This is my final year. There was shouting. There was, when a speaker was on, when I was speaking myself on Senate, there was shouting, laughing, remarks being shouted out. I was part of events, university events, where speakers were verbally and physically interrupted from speaking. Does that constitute harassment? Because I'll tell you what, I suffered a great load of emotional and psychological distress after those sessions, suffering an anxiety attack after, you know, pretty much all Senate meetings. So so at the end of it, you know, we're all students, so I guess kind of deal with it. And also one's freedom of speech and expression does not mean that they can shut down or turn off somebody else's freedom of speech and expression.
Right.
And so those are my comments.
I appreciate that, and you said earlier you're worried you're just talking to yourself, and let me assure you, you're not just speaking to yourself. You're also sharing thoughts with all of us and with the working group that take a lot of courage, and it's very much appreciated. And that goes for everyone who's also shared something of their own personal experience with this. It's not an ideological or intellectual issue alone. It's about ideas, but it's about ideas that are also lived, and lived in some cases viscerally by members of this community in real time and in recent memory, and we take that seriously as well. So let me give the last word again to you, and please keep it brief, but very much welcome you to share that last thought.
Thank you. I will keep it brief. I wanted to make sure I was last so that there was no one else waiting behind me. Essentially, freedom of speech, as you said, is not ideologically based. It's fundamentally a nonpartisan issue. Everyone has the right to express themselves, and I wanted to extend an invitation to everybody in this room and everybody watching this live stream to please come to Students for Free Speech at York University. Let us know what your concerns are with regards to this working group and this policy, and we can work together as students to have as much representation as possible moving forward. So yeah, that's the comment I wanted to make.
No, thank you for that, and the invitation is out there, and of course to continue this dialogue, whether uploading the written forms or contacting the working group in any way. And again, to those who did express or hear some views that they disagreed with, that they were opposed to or felt were not fair or not accurate, the respect by and large shown by everyone in this room has really been very impressive to me, and I've learned a tremendous amount, as have other members of the working group. The work's not done, the concerns don't end here, and by participating, we don't take this consultation to be a box that's now ticked. So please know that that's very much an expectation that we share in. I hope everyone enjoys a great rest of the day and that we continue the important discussion. Thanks again. Great. Hang on. No, I'm good. I just got to get the Scotch tape off one's body.